I'm going to start with Mr. Coffey. And the question is, and everybody can weigh in, the question is, how do you see the stop and frisk policy of the NYPD? Is it a tool that prevents crime or abuse of civil and human rights? Would your office sponsor a follow-up study to be done to the one similar to the one done by Elliot Spitzer when he was in the Attorney General's office?
I think there's some serious questions about the constitutionality and scope of the stop and frisk policy. I would support a new study, that I would want to make sure was absolutely independent and accurate. I do think that progressive and proactive police activity is helpful to the community in order to, when it's well-based and there is an articulable basis for a stop and a frisk, for that to happen. I think that helps protect communities. The problem is when it's abused and it's used as a pretext for harassment. And that's wrong. My office, if I'm the Attorney General, would vigorously investigate that. I should note, I spent 11 years at a law firm that handled employment discrimination cases on behalf of aggrieved employees. I went to the firm for its role in the case in the Texaco race discrimination case, the largest settlement for African American employees at the time, and was proud to work on cases involving African American bankers who were being discriminated against at Bank of America. So I come from that area and be very, very aggressive with the Civil Rights Bureau in pursuing, from a government perspective, that which my firm pursued in the private area.
Thank you. Mr. Donallo, same question.
Yes, I would support such a report. I think that the work that Elliot Spitzer did in the Wallkill matter was fantastic, and the person who headed public integrity at that time was Mark Peters, and I hired him to take over a section of the insurance department which was in need of some major reforms, and he did a great job there also. I think that those cases can be done effectively and quickly. There's statistical studies, so the record's been created, and the question is whether there is statistical evidence of discrimination in such stop and frisk matters. And I think that you don't really necessarily have to go out and do undercover investigations, and it's not all that expensive to basically assign some attorneys at the office to review the data and do the kind of study that I think, given that it's something that I'm asked about at almost every single stop in the city, is something that really seems like we should take a serious look at.
Mr. Brodsky?
In its purest form, stop and frisk is what Arizona just did. It is an expression in its support. And it's important in Arizona, it's important in New York. And if the study, which I think we'll all agree ought to be done, shows that it's being used in ways similar to what Arizona represented, it's got to be stopped. I would suggest to you that the battle to stop is a political struggle. It is a political struggle that takes coalitions between the affected communities, which tend to be communities of color, and leaders who have an ability to stand up and simply say, stop, it's enough. Not just as a lawyer would say, but as a politician and a leader would say. If there are competing visions of the office beginning to emerge, it is that in the end, whatever lawyer-like skills we bring, whatever abilities we bring on particular substantive issues, the leadership and the willingness to stand very clearly and very effectively to speak to those with whom we disagree. I can have a wonderful conversation with civil liberties advocates because I share that basic view. But to change the public attitude toward stop and frisk in a city that just suffered an almost threat seems to me to require a certain kind of leadership. And I ask you very carefully, as you consider your individual support for an individual human being here, to decide for yourselves what you want out of the office and what you want out of the kind of political leadership that can bring you there, not just what will be 5 or 6 sensible answers to specific public policy questions. Thank you.
Mr. Schneiderman?
Thank you. Yes, I do agree about the study, but let me just say, this is just a symptom of a much larger problem. And the problem is this, and I've worked in the justice system, as I told you, for a long, long time. I was sat on the Sentencing Commission that was created by Governor Spitzer for 18 months and heard evidence from people all over America about what actually reduces crime and gets people back in the out of the cycle of crime and violence and drug dependency. We're not doing that in New York. We are not looking at the empirical evidence. The problem we've got in the United States right now, and that I speak about all the time, and the Attorney General is the top law enforcement officer in the state, one of my commitments is to use that platform, as Elliot did on Wall Street, as Andrew did on student loans, to take up the issue of mass incarceration. Because the problem in our criminal justice system now is that the incentives for the police are to stop more people. The incentives are to arrest more people. The incentives for prosecutors are to put away more people, right? We now have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. We lock up more people than China, which is much bigger than us. We lock up more people than any democracy has ever locked up. And we have to have the courage to stand up, because look, this is all the fault of like our predecessors and colleagues who spent 30 years being afraid of being accused of being soft on crime, and that's what leads you to vote for Rockefeller drug laws, 3 strikes you're out laws, mandatory minimums. So the stop and frisk policy is a symptom of a much larger problem, and this requires our willingness to take it on at its root. We know what works. We know what gets people out of the cycle of crime, and it's not locking people up for years and years and everyone paying a prison tax so we can keep almost 2.5 million people in prison and have 700,000 people a year dumped out into poor communities, mostly African American and Latino, and with no reentry and no programs, and wonder why those communities have trouble. That is something that I will take from my first day in the Attorney General's office as a part of my job, transforming, not just reforming, the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Ms. Rice.
Well, I want to extend an invitation to Senator Schneiderman to come out and see what we're doing in Nassau County along the lines of the initiative that we did in the village of Hempstead, because it is happening here, and it's happening very close. It's happening right here in New York, in Nassau County. So I hope he comes out to look at that. I think it might change his views on some things. I think that stop and frisk can be a useful law enforcement tool. But when it is used to engage in racial profiling, obviously that is a problem. I believe that the present Attorney General is looking into that right now. The recent study, the recent statistics that show a disproportionate effect on people of color, as well he should, and I would continue that also. I think it's a question of training, but I also think at its core, it's a question of education. It's a question of education. I appointed the first biased crime prosecutor in the history of the DA's office in Nassau, and there's a reason for that. Because there's too many biased crimes, there's too much racism out there, and we need to get to the core issue, and it's education. Thank you.